what made you write the book Beyond Virtue in the first place? And where did you start?
Yeah, thanks so much for that question. So it does have an interesting sort of heritage in terms of my own thinking, because I never did anything in psychology before. I always did philosophy of education. So in the first place, I was motivated by my experiences teaching as a teacher in cross-cultural settings to do the research to write the book. So I've been in Hong Kong for almost 10 years now. And when I first got here, I noticed some challenges with my teaching. So in the United States, we try to be what we call very student-centered, try to be very happy and positive. People talk about how good it is to be happy in education. So what does that mean in terms of practice? It means students and teachers would be smiling at each other. Students would feel very free to ask questions, to offer their opinions, maybe even a little bit informal. And this has been a trend in education in the States and in Western countries to be more informal and more chatty and more like friends or family members and very warm relations. But I noticed this didn't really work in Hong Kong. And not only did it not work, but it actually failed and went the wrong direction. So I found the more that I tried to encourage my students by showing them I liked them, that I was happy and comfortable, I wanted them to succeed, I cared about them, being a little bit lighthearted, focusing on the students themselves. It did the opposite of what I wanted it to do. The students would actually become more serious. And over time, I realized that in Hong Kong, being successful in education is associated with working hard, being disciplined, and being serious. Actually, being happy in Hong Kong doesn't mean smiling in this really big way that Americans smile. So what happened was this negative spiral would occur, and they would become embarrassed by my behavior. So I would be trying to encourage them to be more happy, be more informal, and this would cause them to become more embarrassed. They would become more serious because they knew that I wasn't happy with them and I wanted them to change. So they're just trying to be the best students they could to show they cared about me by being more and more serious. So both of us would just feel more and more anguish. And I realized that the way that we understood learning and being thoughtful and caring in education actually had different behaviors and different emotions around it. And so once I realized this was happening, it really blew my mind. I had actually taught in classes about McDonald's in Hong Kong. And when McDonald's first came to Hong Kong, it had a motto, it has a global motto for its training. So it says service with a smile. And actually people have done research about this saying in Hong Kong, that's not appropriate because smiling is seen as not being caring and serious. It's seen as being sort of unprofessional and uncaring. So they had to throw that away when they moved to Hong Kong originally. So the next step for me was realizing, okay, this is my experience coming to Hong Kong, originally from the US, but students like mine in Hong Kong, they're actually in schools all over the world. They're in high schools, they're in primary schools, they're in universities in Canada, in Europe, in Australia, the United States. And I've noticed since I've moved to Hong Kong that my colleagues from Western countries, they're always asking me, how do I deal with these shy, passive, quiet Asian students? And I started realizing that I'd missed the points, but that they were also missing the points. These weren't shy or passive students, actually. They just had a totally different orientation towards showing caring, showing an appropriate relationship in education. So blaming them for not being smiling or opinionated totally missed the points. They were doing everything that they believed was appropriate to do in an education setting. At the same time I started thinking about writing this book, I also had some personal things happening in my life at the same time. So I was getting divorced around the same time, and in that process I saw a counselor, and I started realizing the way that emotions impact everything about the way we relate to others. And I'd never really studied psychology before writing this book. I also realized that cultural differences are one thing, but there's also differences across gender, that women have certain challenges they face in relationships and in professional settings, which tend to be different from the challenges that men face in terms of being arrogant or assertive or confident or something like this. So my goal was to intersect a political view of emotions in social life and public life with cultural view and with sociological view, and apply that in education. So this definitely was, you're right, it was a Herculean task, and it evolved over time quite a bit. So in the first place, I think my own perspective, I was informed by people who did some really important work in some of the key areas related to my book. So Megan Bowler on power and politics in education. Christian Christensen has written several books on the theories behind psychological views of emotions and virtues. And Sarah Ahmed has written a lot about gender, race, and emotions. But even with these scholars coming before me, it actually felt like I was doing a whole new PhD to do the research for this book. But at the same time, it was really interesting to me because it was a very complicated challenge for me to understand how do psychological views intersect and connect with these philosophical views. Because in real life, we have all of these perspectives which relate to psychology, moral philosophy, sociology, and real life is complicated. So it does require diving into something complex. In reality, we can try to keep things simple. You know, we can just try to teach students to be resilient or to be happy, but people have been discussing this for centuries. They've been discussing this, and a lot of what they've been discussing has been not really working, and I think that's because the view does need to be a bit more complicated. So it's been a really wonderful exploration for me. And now with COVID-19, a lot of us are thinking more about our emotions and well-being in relation to work, life, and education. And I did the research and wrote the book before that, before COVID-19. But that's another impetus. I hope people can learn from this book and find it worthwhile.